wanted my launch to be about my community. And I invited a few people to share little 1-minute stories from their lives when a moment of change, which is an idea that I come back to over and over in the memoir. So I'm going to start with just a few of those.
So a long time ago, up until the early 90s, I used to use regular toilet paper. I can't remember what kind. It was probably whatever the cheapest kind was. Until I heard Jello Biafra say in a spoken word performance, "We are literally wiping our asses with the future." And I thought, you know, he's right. And ever since then, whenever possible, I buy toilet paper made from recycled paper. I like to think that Jello Biafra saved whole entire forests from my ass. Thank you, Jello.
I was a brutalized child until age 16 when I picked up a steak knife and I stabbed my father in the neck and I tried to kill him. He survived. I became a victim of self-hatred and devolved into a life of petty crime until I decided to become a better criminal, bigger criminal, and I robbed 30 banks. I graduated in the criminal world, spent 7 years in prison, confined in solitary confinement for 2 years, until I decided to change my life and turn myself into a writer.
As a sophomore in high school in Orange County, suburbia, I was kind of awkward and had a couple of friends who I ate lunch with every day on the lawn. We were all listening to Led Zeppelin, Jethro Tull, and the Beatles, if you were cool. I had a Van Halen poster on my bedroom wall. My music tastes were pretty much standard for the time, until punk rock arrived in my life. That summer, my friend Steve had gone to London and returned with his long surfer hair gone and replaced with a mohawk. I freaked out. He turned me on to the Sex Pistols' first and only album. Soon, I convinced my older sister and her best friend to take me to the Whiskey A Go-Go on Sunset Strip to see the Dead Kennedys. They hated them, but I was hooked. A couple years later, I moved into a 2-bedroom house in Long Beach, paid $50 a month rent. Friends lived in the front yard, backyard, and in a van on the street. I spray painted on my bedroom walls. Everything is permanent and everything is temporary. Yep, punk rock changed my life.
She is happy. She is free. She is energetic. She is awesome. She's very funny. She's dancing all the time. She's singing all the time. Yeah, that was me until the moment that my father died. When he died 2 years ago with lung cancer, I felt that somehow I changed. My joy is not the same joy, or maybe some joy left with him. So maybe the words that people can use to describe me are somehow different. That's what I am now, a changed person.
So those were words from Dawn Oberg, Joe Loya, Ma Shane Wynn, and Anna Kahlo. And thank you all so much for contributing. I'm going to read a little bit from the book, and I'm just going to start at the beginning because it's the launch. So I am 50 years old and have just moved to a seaside town in Portugal. I'm reading in a quiet bar when a man asks why a beautiful woman like me is alone. What he means is, what is happening between your legs? What he means is, you're breaking the rules of the story, but I can set you straight. What he means is, I can fill that terrible gap between your legs. To be unattached at my age is a violation of the story. This man wants an explanation. If my answer isn't plausible, if there is no man waiting around the corner or recently dead or banging a college student, I should be grateful that he is offering me a happy ending. His desire lands on my shoulders like a bird of prey. What he means is, I need you to fill the gap in me. I like to be alone, I say. A single no is not enough. I say no to him and no again. But I have learned to pull the sting of the no. My smile says, how charming you are, but your desire has nothing to do with me. He offers a ride and is baffled at my refusal, baffled and offers again and again, as though a refusal is just part of the dance, as if I could be worn down to a yes. Tonight is lucky. This man, on this night, chooses not to force the issue. Only a few weeks later in the same town, another man will not give so easily. I've been dancing in a Saturday night discotheque with him and his friends. When I turn to leave, he follows me out to the street. My Portuguese is infant level, but it's clear that he is insisting that I stay. He makes his hands into a heart shape, holds them over his chest. This man is thickly muscled with a shaved head and hard face, and he is pleading with me not to abandon him. Sozinho, I say, one of the first words I learned in Portuguese. Sozinho. Eu quero sozinho. I want alone. He seems to relent. He leans in for the beijinhos, the cheek kiss, but as he gets close, he grabs my face and forces his tongue into my mouth. I push him away, step back, then turn and walk, hot and fast. I wind up and down streets and duck into a friend's club, watch from inside to make sure the man hasn't followed. A friend asks, what's going on? Being a woman is hazardous, I say. He looks at me for a beat, then nods. And then I'm free to walk home alone in the dark of the sleeping town. I have believed in freedom for so long, had felt I'd found it, had arrived at freedom over and over again. But tonight I know it is a perpetually receding goal, Zeno's arrow halving the distance forever. This is the best I have, a lonely walk through a quiet town. Every story begins with the everyday. Every day, the girl crept from her bed of ashes to clean for her stepsisters. Every day, the wives of Manassas and Heber served their husbands. Every day, the first woman played naked in the garden. You could call her innocent, but the word meant nothing then. Innocence only comes to life as the mirror image of sin, reversed left to right. Every day, I woke, carried out of dreams on the sound of my husband's sleeping breaths behind me. Every day, sunlight striped the dresser and all the day's responsibilities shouldered into my head, jostling for space. Bed to shower to living room while Gabe slept, read the news on my laptop, comics, wrote a few words before work. I kissed my husband awake before leaving the house, a short walk to the bus and soft morning air. Every day, I swear, every day I thought, this is how contentment feels. Nothing new, I said to my mom on the phone. It's weird, there's really no news. This is happiness, isn't it, Mom? I had escaped the stranglehold of my childhood religion, escaped Utah, escaped a bad relationship. I was married, and rupture with my parents healed, free of the stories that harassed my youth, loved in the deepening intimacy of couplehood. So, said Mom, her voice taking on its coy, joking lilt, when will I hear the pitter-patter of little feet? Mom's half joke. For years before I married Gabe, it was, you know, I have to ask about the M word. But now that I was safely buttoned up in a marriage, the question shifted to babies. Mom was making fun of herself, laughing at the stereotypical Mormon mom question, but there was longing in her voice. Well, There's a good school here, I said. This was the everyday that begins every story, before the ash-smeared girl went to the ball, before Heber's wife Yael lifted a hammer, Manassas's widow Judith a sword, before the woman in the garden stuffed her mouth with knowledge, a single sin multiplied inside her womb, giving birth to all of humanity. This is the time before until. Without until, there would be no story. The aughts. I am 36 years old and I'm bleeding. I finished the white pills 2 days ago, moved on to the green in my pill pack. My period hasn't stopped. I've been on the pill more than 15 years, and all that time, maybe a smear of reddish black the day after white pills, but today, the flow is as full as ever. 3 days, 4, now it's weeks, and I'm still bleeding. Little spotting is normal, says my doctor. This isn't spotting, I say. She shrugs, writes me a prescription for a different pill. The bleeding draws in, lessens for 2 days, 3, before flooding out with new energy. It was only taking a breath. My husband and I have been talking about babies. I mean, we're picking carefully around landmines. I mean, we're talking about it. Gabe said from the beginning he wanted kids with me, but I sensed a shadow behind his certain words. Last month, his daughter came to stay with us for just a couple of weeks. She is growing up, 12 years old, coming into her own as a person, sliding down that terrifying slope into adolescence. I love her visits. We took her out to the rocky shore below Sutro Baths. She painted her shoes and mine with rainbows and stars, and we wore our cheerful shoes as we clambered over wet, shining rocks. My husband was petrified, on edge like I'd never seen him. His daughter seemed the slightest bit bored if things didn't go perfectly. I saw his face, the look of a man who had taken the first step into midair off a cliff. One evening, I dropped a bottle of red nail polish and shattered it on the kitchen floor, painting bright red across our white tiles. Gabe lost it. His face flushed, he yelled and stomped. I got the mop and led him out of the kitchen. I cleaned the tiles while he sat on the couch in full panic mode, gesticulating to himself. My stepdaughter drew her feet up, tucked her knees under her chin, and went quiet. We are settled and happy in San Francisco, but Gabe's anxiety seems to be ratcheting up. He stays up long after I go to bed, and when he finally joins me, I can hear him fidgeting in the dark beside me. He is lying in bed with his eyes open, and I know he is eating himself with worry. He worries about money, about failure, about fucking up his daughter, about fucking up with me, about the war in Iraq, about his ex-wife, about work, about his boss. He worries, he frets, he spins himself into knots, and he doesn't know how to move forward, how to even begin undoing his knots. I don't know how to help him. Maybe it is a bad idea to have children with this man, I think. Maybe it will be the final anxiety, the one that will kill him, kill us. A week or so after my stepdaughter left, I started my period, and it didn't stop. So I'm going to play a few more short videos before we start the conversation with Erin.
That's me, like 15 years old. I had been picked on, bullied a lot as a kid, and by this point it had kind of turned around so that I just didn't give a fuck what anybody thought and was super contrarian and getting kicked out of classes and getting arrested and all kinds of trouble, until my mom one day said to me, you know, high school's a drag and it's not working for you. Let's just get you through it as quickly as possible because I promise you will find your people in college. So we signed me up for the independent study program at the public high school in this small town in California, expecting like dittos and worksheets, high school for dummies. Instead, we got Chris Clark. He taught out of a literal broom closet in the library that he had lined floor to ceiling with bookshelves stacked 2 and 3 deep. I went in every Wednesday for 3 years, chose my own materials out of his amazing collection, wrote 10 essays a week, and we discussed it, you know, and my mind just cracked open. I read Camus and Machiavelli, it was really marvelous. And I was never the same. You know, the most amazing thing was that, like, he saw this pissed off kid and he saw an intellectual. It changed my life.
After I gave up medicine, I taught high school for 7 years, mostly freshmen, 14-year-olds, beautiful epitome of bright young things. And they would ask me, Dr. J, did you want to be a teacher when you grew up? Did you want to be a doctor when you grew up? How did you know? And of course, I actually didn't. My life has been a series of transitions based on what I want now that has grown with me as I knew better and knew worse, actually. And until has always been a huge part of it, because I'm going to keep going until I know who I am and until I get what I want.
When I was 30, I came to the realization that I've been living my entire life for other people and with other people in mind, and keeping my own priorities at a minimum. And so I made this big radical change and I moved to Europe. I sold everything I owned, and with 6 suitcases and a toddler and a car seat, I fled the country and I moved to a completely different place. And I focused on learning a language and living a different life in a different culture, and going down to the bare bones and rebuilding exactly the life that I wanted. But it wasn't until I learned to say no at the age of 32 that it finally became all about me.
Hi, I'm Sakya, and there was a time in my life that I was super depressed. I didn't feel like doing anything. I didn't go to school. I barely went outside until my dad enrolled me in a pottery class. I was supposed to go once a week, but it was so awesome to create stuff and get dirty and mess around with clay that I ended up going a lot more often. I made so many pots that I didn't know what to do with that I ended up selling them. I was able to combine 2 things that I love, art and money, into something productive and get myself out of depression.
So that was Alia Volz, Jamila Jamison, Joy Hanford, and Sakya Rajawasan. Thank you. And Erin, thanks so much for your patience.
Of course. I'm so excited to talk about the book. So when Caitlin asked if I'd do the Q&A, I was really excited. And there's something that she had pointed out to me when reading my book, and it's something that I noticed in reading her book, that there were, even though our lives were very different, there were themes that we had in our lives and in our memoirs that were very similar. And it was interesting to see that sort of reflected from like another perspective, where there's so much similarity and then it's very different as well. So I'm very excited to talk about this. I'm gonna ask some questions, and I'm gonna keep an eye on time because I wanna make sure that we have enough time for other people to ask questions too. Don't forget to leave questions in the chat box, and we'll go from there and have a good conversation. So I made notes because I wanted to make sure that I remembered what I wanted to ask. So the first thing that I want to ask is sort of like something that I'm always interested in when I read memoirs, is that I want to know what the memoir conception story was. So when I was before writing my memoir, I was exploring events and themes that ended up in my memoir through personal essays. And I began to realize that they were gathering together, sort of pooling into this narrative that I felt compelled to tell. So my question is, was there a certain point in which you realized that you were writing toward a memoir?
I tricked myself for a few years by writing a novel that I finished called Beautiful Men, but it was really very thinly disguised memoir. And I would not admit that I was writing memoir. I would not admit that I wanted to write memoir until I wrote an essay about the having to have a hysterectomy at the same time that my mother died. And I wrote the essay sort of in a rush and sent it out to my dream editor, who was Roxane Gay, and she published it. And then a couple of people said, "So are you working on a memoir?" And that was when I started to realize I'd been lying to myself the whole time I was working on my novel. So yeah, it was a slow progression.
I understand. So I mentioned this at the beginning about like sort of the parallel themes in our books, and I think that's definitely true. So there was a point in the book where you're speaking about your mother, but sort of like underneath that, you're also speaking about yourself. You write, "Depression is anger turned inward. Mom has been wishing to obliterate herself for years." That really struck me because I operated that way for so long. And I think a lot of people have evolving relationships with anger and the ways in which we try to suppress it or disguise it. I want to read one other short passage from your book about anger, and then I'm going to ask the question. This is sort of towards the end of the book. You write, "All these years, I'd turned my white-hot anger against myself for failing to stop what happened. It's telling that I am not angry with my father. Protection, my subconscious brain says, is a mother's job, a woman's job. But look at this. Anger, says Adam Phillips, who wrote Unforbidden Pleasures, is hope. Hope that things can be different, that frustration can be modified. Maybe not hope exactly, but you can't be angry unless you believe things should be different. My whole life, I've believed the world around me was as it should be. I was the one who was wrong, misaligned. I am angry now. Finally, I believe in a different possibility. I have to keep going." So the reason that I picked those 2 points were, one, that you wrote about anger in a way that really struck me, and also that there's a shift in that second passage where you are feeling the anger. And so I guess I'm curious if, in addition to having sort of like your relationship with anger change in your life before you wrote the book, did you also feel any sort of shift in the way you understood anger from having written about it?
Yeah. And by the way, I love that you pulled that out, because in your book, there was that buried anger, and that was so powerful, the way it was working in you and in your book. So I love that you, you found that and saw that. Women, those of us who are raised as women, are raised with a different relationship to anger. Mm-hmm. So we're not supposed to be angry. We're supposed to keep it inside. You know, we know all of this. And I have a lot of friends who are men who started from a different place. They started with anger that they couldn't control, and then learned how to control it. And they would be talking to me from this place of having learned to control their anger, whereas I was coming from a place where I hadn't even learned how to recognize it.
Right.
And so there's a completely different trajectory needed for those of us who are socialized as women. We have a whole different relationship to anger, and we have to be able to own up to it. And there is righteous use for anger. There really is, and there's a great deal of power in it. And in writing the book, I did have to find a way to get through that to get past turning it inward. Right. And then once you manage to do that, then the work is focusing it in the right direction.
Yeah, I love that idea of anger being a sign of hope.
Yes.
You know, that was very sort of like revelatory when I read it. I was like, I never have sort of like put it in that perspective. And I really liked that so much, that like sort of that journey that you go from like denying the anger to feeling the anger, and then not seeing it as something bad, but as something hopeful.
And in fact, I can see it in the US right now. There is righteous anger that is the one thing that's I think is a source of hope right now for people in the US. I'm saying that from outside the US.
Right. No, I agree.
But it's a real power that is being tapped and should be tapped right now. It's hope.
I love that. Okay, I'm going to be picking on a couple of different passages here. So there's another passage in the book that I read and reread several times. And in one of your videos, someone mentioned it, this concept of until. And I want to read it because for anyone who hasn't read it, or just as a refresher, I think it's important before I ask my question. Yael's until came when she betrayed her husband's tribe to kill Sisera. Judith's after she was widowed. They were wives until. I was a wife until. Not one thing, no unforgivable offense. Only I have to go. Only I begin to fantasize about my own place like a lover. I trained for wiving, but I'm not made to be a wife. The until is a becoming. You can't become a warrior until you separate your identity from your husband's. You can't move out of the warmth of your home, culture, religion until something shakes you free, cracks open the earth to expose your roots. I lift my roots like skirts and go. First of all, that last sentence, I love that sentence so much. I lift my roots like skirts and go. So as I was saying before I read this, I think so many of us, especially those of us raised as women, have had many moments of coming to that place of until, and that place where we shake free. And I think that also in our identity as writers, that's a lot of what we do, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. There's like an unearthing, a becoming, a shaking things loose. And so I guess my question is that how you think as well? Do you think that we reach many moments like this, that like many of these until moments in life? And are those sort of, I just love that idea of like until as a becoming.
I very much love that you talk about many of those moments. The traditional idea of story is one arc, right? The hero's journey, right? Where it's obstacle, gets over it, there's the change, and everything is happy. And one of the things you talk about in Strung Out is that nobody tells you you're going to relapse over and over. It's just going to happen. And the real life is messy, and there are 100 turns in the story, 100 becomings that you go through. And I also, I think it's a difference in a friend of mine was in a documentary called Protagonist, where it was all of these men, it was all men who had gone through some major change in their lives. And the filmmaker is a woman. And when somebody asked why are there no women in this, she said, women's stories are not so tidy. It's not that strong hero's arc.
Right.
And I'm much more interested in these different kinds of stories that show much more complicated turnings.
Right.
And the ways that we can become many different people in a single life.
I think, yeah, I mean, I think that if we don't allow ourselves imperfect transformations, then we never will transform, right? I mean, I think that's part of it. And I think that,
yeah,
it's certainly for me and for a lot of people I know that struggle against perfectionism. So then if I can't do it perfect, I'm just going to be really fucked up. Just to make like having those moments. So I think that I just really liked that you had many of those moments in the book, and then you just so eloquently put it in that passage where it was like this, like taking what you had written about and distilling it in this way that I just really, really loved. Okay, I have a craft question too. It's less about theme and more about craft. So I'm always interested in like craft choices when I talk to writers, especially with memoir, because I think that often when people speak to memoirists, they forget that you are still a writer crafting a narrative out of true events. So it's not this easy thing where you're just like, oh, I'm just going to write down what happened in my life.
Yeah.
You know, you are still creating narrative arcs, multiple narrative arcs, and deciding about narration and all of that. So I thought that the use of present tense in your book worked really well. And I'd say, I don't know, you maybe don't see it as much in memoir, although you do see it. I just wanted to know if you set out from the beginning knowing that you wanted to have the narration in present tense, or if that was something that you had played around with, or if there was a specific reason for it, or it just felt right.
It was something that I was playing with, and I wasn't completely sold on it.
Right.
But it persisted through all of my drafts and rewrites, even as the book changed a great deal in my rewrites. The present tense persisted. And I think it became a way for me to hold on to the immediacy of the stories.
Right. Yeah, I think it worked beautifully.
It was a risk.
Yeah. No, it can be a risk, but I think that like, I don't know. I mean, I didn't even like really notice it at first. I was just reading, and then I noticed it, and I was like, oh, it worked. So, sometimes I've read things in present tense that felt like I noticed it right away because maybe it felt off, but here I just thought it worked really seamlessly. So I was curious about that. Okay, this is another sort of craft question, or writer, memoirist question. So, you know, for when you're writing memoir, we're writing about our lives, but we also have to write about the people in our lives. And I know for myself and for most memoirists, it's very important that when writing memoir, we include other people through our lens without telling their stories for them. And I think you did this really well, especially with your parents. And I'm just curious if you set any parameters for yourself in regards to how you wrote about the other characters in the book.
Yeah, I was not trying to think. I didn't like spell out
Right.
boundaries, but I was very careful about being as, if I was going to be unsparing with somebody else, I would be equally unsparing with myself. And I did not want to assert anything that I wasn't sure of.
Mm-hmm.
So I really worked hard to make sure that I was coming from a very solid place with.
And I really appreciated you had a lot of moments where, especially traumatic moments, where you didn't remember, like you have no memory of what happened, or you have like one memory about a sound or something. And I think that's such an accurate way that trauma records. And I really appreciate that sort of honesty where you weren't trying to fill in the picture. You were really coming from a place of what your memory of that is. And unfortunately, I think for anyone that has gone through trauma, those traumatic moments just don't record in any sort of linear way for us.
Really
so
don't. Really don't.
I appreciated that honesty of telling.
That's really nicely done in Strung Out, by the way.
Thank you.
A particular moment when a memory is triggered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just have one more question, and then we'll open it up to everyone else. So please drop your questions in the chat. So of course, this is the question that everyone gets asked after reading Wiving. I'm so excited to hear about what you're doing next. Are you working on another book-length project?
I am. And I am not certain if it's straight memoir.
Mm-hmm.
But it's definitely drawing on my traveling years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it might be memoir, it might be fiction or autofiction.
Well, I'm excited to read it, whatever it is. I'm going to scroll through here really quickly and see. Okay, so Stacy asks, how did your book change in rewrites, and what was that journey like for you?
It changed hugely in rewrites. It was a formless mess. Early on, I was just writing. It took me 3 drafts before I really knew what the book was about.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when the title came to me. And it was the title that gave me my organizing principle.
Right.
That gave it its spine. Because as you know, a life is big and messy.
And for a memoir, you're talking about something that's more finite. So you really do have to have like a central spine, and so much gets left out because it's not about, it's not an autobiography, it's a memoir.
Yes. Yeah. So then once you have your spine, you just figure out what hangs directly off that spine. And it was the title that finally did that for me. There were in fact early drafts where I was telling stories the same way I told them to friends as I was growing up, which I realized in the process of writing was not entirely honest. So
yeah, I mean, I mean, sometimes we have to write our way to we have to write through to the truth, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's not a comfortable thing to do in any way.
Oh no. No.
And I think that it's funny because I was thinking about this as I was reading yours as well, because you and I both had struggled with some like of that, like sort of wanting people to like us, wanting people to love us, wanting people to think we were good. And I had to really put all of that sort of like tendency that I have still, although I've done a lot of growth, aside and risk being unlikable in the book. And I think that you also did that. You also had to risk being unlikable. And I think that that's, you know, it's not an easy thing to do.
It's really not, you know.
I know. Okay, let's see. I'm going to go through a few questions here. Okay. Did you have an agent or book deal already when you wrote the book, or before you started going through all these drafts? So did you sell on proposal or a draft?
No. I had written the novel, and I'd written the essay, and I'd sent the novel out to agents, and then got interest from an editor based on the essay, and then did end up getting an agent who had looked at the novel, and she was wonderful. I worked with her through many of the drafts, but we did part company. But she was great during the early process. But I did not have it sold. Right. I tried to do a proposal. That's not my.
Writing a proposal, like I say, is harder. Even if you've written the whole thing, writing a proposal is harder than writing the book.
Yeah. It's like, no, I just want to say it the way I'm going to say it. Yeah.
Okay, here's a question. When did you decide you needed to tell your story? What gave you the drive and the inspiration?
Oh, that's a really good question, because I think I knew that I needed to before I admitted it to myself, which is where the novel came in.
Right.
Yeah. I started writing the novel when I was at MacDowell, where you've been, and I had gone planning to do rewrites on a different novel, and found that the stories from my life just kept coming up.
Right. Oh, I know that feeling.
Yeah.
You can't move forward with anything else until you tell that story.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, here's another one. Do you write plays with so much theater background?
Oh, I did once upon a time. Yeah. In fact, I wrote a one-woman show for my senior project in college.
Oh, how cool.
Before I dropped out. And yeah, I used to belong to this this group called Playground in the Bay Area, where we would get a topic on Friday, and we would have the weekend to write a 10-minute play based on that topic. And then they would choose one of the plays that were submitted over the weekend, and actors would practice through the week and perform it at the end of the week.
How cool.
It was a gas. It was so much fun. So, and my mom was a playwright too, so, as well as a poet.
Right. Okay, here's another one. Any advice on digging deeper or unpacking a scene? I'm a former journalist and I'm always told I've struck gold with scenes, but need to dig deeper. How do you live in the pain and take care of yourself at the same time?
That's a good one. I bet you could answer that one too. I think a lot of it is the first time you tell a story is often the surface. It's often the practiced story. And you need to keep going back over and over again, especially when it's something difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It helps to have somebody you really trust who can read. A trusted reader can be very helpful. But there were certain scenes that I wrote as fiction. I wrote as poetry. I had to write them 7 times before it felt true. And taking care of yourself is part of the process.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think sometimes, especially for when you're writing about trauma, there needed to be enough distance, time-wise, from certain things before I was ready to write about it.
Yeah.
And I always say, like, having sort of all of your sort of like self-care tools in place, whether that's like a therapist or, you know, your trusted friend or an activity, physical activity that really like helps you, or meditation or whatever it is. I think that we definitely, especially when writing about traumatic things, need those things in place.
Yeah. I'm very lucky that my therapist did Skype sessions long before pandemic.
Yes, yeah.
So.
Okay, let's see. I think we have time for a couple more. Okay. I'm curious how your thinking on the idea of aloneness, especially as a woman, evolved while writing. I'm also curious if you got a lot of pushback to the fact that Wiving essentially gives women permission to revel in being alone. Thank you for doing that, by the way.
It was, I had to fight for time alone with romantic partners. Mm-hmm. Really fight. It didn't feel like something that I could claim. It felt so indulgent to want to spend time alone and not be taking care of the man's needs. But I knew I needed it. I knew I needed it for the work, and I discovered that I needed it for my sanity too.
Right.
But what I found is that when I did get to be alone and faced the real terror of loneliness, mm-hmm. when and my therapist would say, so what if you just sat with it? I'd say, oh, I'm so scared of being alone. And once I got underneath it, that's when I found connection with other human beings.
Right.
Was underneath that loneliness. Mm-hmm. That's where I struck writing gold. And I think women have not been socialized to value our time alone.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where it's a sad story instead of the, you know, the heroic riding off into the sunset that the cowboy gets.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not a sad story. It's actually an adventure. So.
Two more quick questions. Well, I mean, there's more than two here, but I'm just going to pick a couple.
Okay.
Do you still have a close relationship with your stepdaughter?
Yes. Yes. I adore her. She is a magnificent woman, and she works with domestic abuse survivors.
Mm-hmm.
I have enormous respect for this woman. And I feel very, very lucky that I get to know her and get to Zoom with her now and then. So, yeah.
Okay, this is a good one. How did you organize the writing since you write in parallel timelines? Did you write it in a linear way from beginning to end, or did you write chapters based on what anecdote you wanted to write and then piece them together afterward?
I wrote fragments. I work in Scrivener, which I discovered while I was writing, which is, it allows you to work in bits that you can then just move around, which is the way I write anyway. That's how I wrote the novel, because I don't think very linearly. So yeah, I just work on whatever scene was on fire in my head in a moment.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So I do have a few more little videos to show. I'll show those, and maybe we can take one or two more questions when I come back, if there's time.
That would be awesome. Yeah, there are a couple more questions, so we can definitely get to them after that.
Cool. All right. One moment.
I thought forever was Santa Barbara, with palm trees and beaches and missions all braided together, until the cardboard boxes came out. Then I thought forever would be humidity, green trees and rivers in Pennsylvania's rural towns, until the cardboard boxes came out. Providence, Rhode Island, Oakland, Berkeley, Santa Cruz, all forevers until the cardboard boxes came out. I moved out on my own. I never wanted the cardboard boxes to go away. I moved everywhere I could until I got married. And the cardboard boxes weren't supposed to come out again. Until.
When I was 20 years old, I was having an extremely uncomfortable telephone conversation with my mom. It was triggered by a flurry of anti-bi comments that someone at work was making, and I let this coworker know that I'm gay and I don't appreciate what she's saying, and this sent my mother into absolute hysteria. You mean you told them? I was like, of course I told them. You know, I've been out since I was 17. You know, this is what being out is all about, not hiding anything. Well, she was having none of that, and she found out the name of my therapist, called her, and told her to tell me that I'm not gay, and that is her job to get me to see this. Well, this led to yet another uncomfortable conversation between me and my mother, where she told me it was sick and it was sin. And I told her, you know, I left the Catholic Church a long time ago, so don't be running that sin shit on me. And I also told her there's strong evidence that homosexuality is genetic. To which she responded, Kyle, if it were genetic, they would have screened it out of the population. My mother would go on to live for another 18 years, but she died right then and there for me. And the question for me became, was I going to let God go to the grave too?
When you're an immigrant, so much of your life is about until. When we left Korea when I was 5, just my parents telling me, wait until we get there. My life had just started, so I didn't know what that meant. When we were in Paraguay, it was wait until we get to the United States. And then when I was a grown man, it was wait until you get married and wait until you have kids. But some of those untils never come. And now we're in a pandemic, locked away from each other, where every day is until. And wonder when we'll run out of things to say, run out of things to wait for.
Okay, I'm going to tell this really quickly. When I was in my early 30s, I got sick with chronic fatigue syndrome, and medical science knew so little about this illness that I had to go inside in order to find my way out of it. And by the way, up until that time, I was in grad school studying comparative literature, getting my PhD, and on a pretty conventional academic track, expected to be a professor, etc. One night when I was sick, I was watching the local news in the Bay Area, and they had a human interest story about a woman in Marin County who kept a detailed dream journal. And I thought that was hilarious because I'm from DC, and never in 1,000 years would the evening news talk about dreams. That would be completely ridiculous. So anyway, this woman said that if you were sick, you could ask your dream what your illness had to teach you. And so I did that night. And in my dream, a voice boomed out very unsubtly and said, "You need to learn that you are precious." Anyway, eventually I got well, and in fact, healthier than I'd ever been, which was amazing. It's a long story how that happened, but dreams were definitely part of that. And part of knowing that you're precious is doing what you most desire to do and not necessarily fitting in. And it turns out that one of the things I most desired to do was to start my own business, Productive Slumber, that helps other people use their dreams to heal and for guidance, etc. And I just want to say that we are all, in a sense, derailed by an illness right now. And when you're derailed, you're not just moved to a different track. Sometimes when you're derailed, you're actually evacuated from the train and placed on a plane or a really fun speedboat. So I guess what I have to say to all of us is we need to learn that we are precious. And that's my very cheesy video. I'm really excited for Caitlin and her book and for all of us that we get to read it. Thanks.
Thanks. So
I think there's like one more question, and before we get to the last question, I just want to say thank you to Evan and Booksmith for doing this today, and encourage everyone that if you don't already have Caitlin's book, to buy it today from Booksmith. And if you already have Caitlin's book, buy another copy or buy another book, because as writers, we would be nowhere without the support of independent bookstores, and they have been hit incredibly hard by the pandemic. Even with online sales, it's not the same as people being able to come in and browse. So if you are able to, I really, really ask that everybody buy at least one book from Booksmith when this is done today.
Absolutely. And even for those of us who are not in the US, you can't buy directly from Booksmith, but you can go to your local independent bookstore, wherever you are, and order the book.
We will ship internationally. You can order from Booksmith. Yeah.
Yay! Yay!
Or your independent bookstore also, for sure.
You can order internationally from the Booksmith. It's a little complicated to Portugal, but but and I also forgot to say that those last videos were B. Boggs, Kyle Smith, Chiwan Choi, and Lael Gold. So thank you.
So there's one last question here, and I hope I didn't miss any others, but is Caitlin planning to teach a writing course on memoir?
Well, golly. It had not occurred to me, but I'm open to ideas. I did teach some creative writing workshops at one point in time, and I loved it. So
maybe stay tuned.
Yeah. So Erin, thank you so much. Evan, thank you so much. Everybody who came, thank you. And everybody who contributed a video, thank you. This is a weird dream come true. So I appreciate everybody for being here. And very last thing, just as a fun little treat, I'm going to show this trailer that was made by a very talented young animator, Jessica Levy. So I'll leave you with that. And I love you all. Thanks very much. Oh, and be sure to buy Strung Out by Erin Khar, also from Booksmith. This is not seamless, sorry. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Erin. Thanks, Evan.
Thank you. Thanks, Erin, for joining us. Thank you, Caitlin. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Hope to see you guys in person soon, but perhaps here on Zoom sooner. Take care, y'all.